That leads us to a couple of other dynasties that arise after the Zhou dynasty, during the classical era of China, if you will. And there's really two of them that we need to talk about. The first was the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty was the shortest of all the dynasties in Chinese history. They only ruled for 11 years, from 221 to 210 BCE. A fascinating group if we had the time to really get into them. They were the first one that created a true empire where the Zhou and the Shang and so on ruled over clans and tried to unite the states. The emperor in the Qin dynasty actually united the people into one centralized government. He had a strong central government that ruled his empire. He was a legalist. This is the dynasty that legalism dominated. Because there's really only one major emperor during the Qin dynasty, he did a lot of really interesting things, but probably the one that has the most lasting significance is that he began the construction of the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China is this incredible architectural marvel that runs for thousands of miles. It is much taller than it might look in a picture like that. It's probably about 40 feet high or so, wide enough that carts can pass each other as they drive by on top of that wall, and it became a defensive structure to protect the Chinese people from invasion from the north and the northwest, which is where most of their enemies seem to come from. The construction of the wall was done with forced labor, which made the Qin dynasty pretty unpopular. They had several other major projects that they were involved with that also caused all kinds of economic hardship and forced people into slave labor, and the result is it was a very unpopular government, and it didn't last very long. In 210 BCE, they were replaced, the mandate of heaven was lost, and a new mandate given to a group that became known as the Han dynasty. And for roughly 400 years, at the very heart of the classical era, from about 200 BCE to 200 CE, the Han became the empire that ruled in China. And they did all kinds of things. They are the model that really becomes the model of how China should be ruled for the centuries that follow. Most notably, the leadership of a guy by the name of Han Wudi. Han Wudi was the emperor from about 141 BCE to 87, and he became the model for Chinese leadership for the ensuing couple of thousand years. He combined the practicality of Confucianism with the practicality of legalism and that cosmic sense that Taoism brings, and the result was really a model of leadership that gets used. There were all kinds of innovations introduced during the Han Dynasty. Books and paper were introduced at this time. Tea began to be cultivated and used as a drink. Stirrups were invented for riding horses. It goes on in terms of what they did. But one of the really key innovations that comes out of the Han Dynasty, particularly starting around the era of Wudi, is the ascendancy of Confucianism and its impact on government. Confucianism now became very powerful, particularly the administrators, the Shure, that were educated in Confucianism and understood it and began to use it to talk about how do you best and most effectively govern. And what they came up with was the idea of the civil service. The civil service was a series of exams that people would take. This was a massive project to study for and pass. This makes your ACT test look like nothing. This was a several-day-long event that you would spend years preparing for, learning all about Chinese life and most notably about Confucianist philosophy, and you had to fully master that to pass the civil service exam. It is built really around the ability of the Shure, and so the Shure become even more important during this time. The idea being that those that scored highest on the exam, that understood Confucianism and relationships and how to build a society, had the most merit, and of course, as we talked about before, you get better government if you have leaders with more merit, so the people who scored best on the exam become the ones who get the positions and the roles within government. And the key to scoring well on the exam is to understand Confucianism. So there's this exam system, and theoretically, it's open to anybody. Anybody in Chinese society can take the civil service exam, do well, and become a part of government. Of course, practically speaking, That doesn't always work. Connections still are helpful. And of course, who can afford to take their son and pull them out of productive labor for years to study and learn in the hopes that they'll do well on this civil service exam? Well, that's going to be the wealthy. So wealth becomes a factor as well, but conceptually what you've got is something that is open to anybody and everybody in Chinese society based on merit. And over the years, as Confucianism comes and goes in popularity, so too does the practices that they espouse, like the civil service system. And what you end up finding is that when Confucianism is popular, the civil service system is used. When Confucianism falls out of favor, the civil service system tends to fall out of favor as well, and it cycles back and forth over the centuries. Confucianist philosophy became important and dominant in other ways too. Women, seen as inferior to men, now begin to lose their status in major ways. Under the Han Dynasty, women become very secondary in Chinese society and lose most of their rights. The other interesting piece that comes out of this is their attitude towards the if you will, the social pecking order. At the top of society, the most important, of course, are people like religious leaders and the emperor and the government people, and the educated, the sure, are at the top of society. But they also like people like artisans and people who are able to do work. Even peasants have a certain amount of status within Chinese society because they're productive. The group that the Confucianists don't like are the merchants. Merchants don't make anything. They don't do anything, according to Confucianist philosophy. Rather, they're leeches that take the work of others and make a profit on it by reselling it and controlling it, and therefore merchants are seen as inferior. Merchants have low status in Chinese society, particularly whenever the Confucianists are powerful. When the Confucianists become less powerful, the merchants sometimes do a little bit better. Now, that doesn't mean that a merchant can't become wealthy in Confucianist society, but wealth isn't seen as something that conveys respect and status. It's what you do with that wealth, and the merchants don't qualify on those terms. That all begins during the Han Dynasty. The other thing that begins to arise during the Han Dynasty is the emergence of the Silk Road, and that's going to become a massively important trade route over the following 1,000 to 1,500 years or so. The Han initially had wanted to contact the other great empire of that era, Rome. They were looking for a military alliance, hoping to get some help and protection against some of the nomadic tribes to their north and northwest that were invading them. They didn't get that military help from the Romans, but what they did do was establish contact. And so the route that connects the eastern part of Asia, where China was, all the way across across Asia to the Mediterranean, and from there even sea routes into Italy and over to Africa and so on, that becomes the Silk Road. It is established during the Han Dynasty, and the Silk Road becomes immensely influential as a trade route, and more to the point, not just a trade route, but it also introduces cultural diffusion. Different ideas begin to spread between civilizations via the Silk Road, and it all starts at this time. One example that comes out of this would be Buddhism. Buddhism came out of India, connected into the Silk Road, and those travelers that then went over into China brought Buddhist concepts with them. It's one of the few philosophies, actually, that ever took root in China and did well that was not native to China, but it came via the Silk Road. The exchange not just of products, but also ideas and knowledge becomes really important, and as a result of that, the Han leave a really important legacy. Eventually, the Han Dynasty lost its mandate of heaven. They began to experience problems, and by about 220 of the Common Era, the Han Dynasty collapsed. And what followed for the next, about 350 years was a series of conflicts. Nobody really emerged with the mandate